so continuing on, same exact thing. We are given points A and B. We're finding point P on the line segment AB. That partitions this line segment up into a ratio of 2 to 1. So AP would be labeled 2, PB would be labeled 1. That means that P is 2/3 of the way from point A. So I'm utilizing A as my starting point. If you want to do if you want to do B, you would do 1/3 of the way from point B. Since I'm using A, I'm going to label A as x1, y1. If you used B, you would label that x1, y1. And now we need to do the slope formula perfectly. It's y2 minus a y1 minus a -2 is really a +2, all over x2 minus an x1, so minus a -3 is really a +3. I have my slope as 3/9, and I do not simplify. This is the only time I will stress not to simplify it. Otherwise, every other time I'm going to ask you to simplify. Okay, so remember the denominator is the run, so that represents all the x, the distance in your x values, and your numerator is the rise, which represents your distance in your y values. So then to find point P, we take our ratio of 2/3, and we multiply it by our run, which is 9, and then we add it to our x value of our starting point, which my starting point was A, so my x value is -3. For your y value, we take our ratio times our rise, and we add it to the y value of our starting point. So I wind up with point P, being 3, 0. All right, next one. We need to be careful about how it's written. So I have my segment AB, and we are finding point P again. However, listen carefully or read this carefully. Your ratio of AP, so we would label AP4, to AB, which is the whole line segment, which is, this will be fixed, 5. So that means that P is 4/5. We just use that ratio from point A. So I'm using A as my starting point, so I'm going to label it as x1, y1, x2, and B, x2, y2. If you use point B as your starting point, your ratio would actually be 1/5, and you would label your point B as x1, y1. I'm going to do the slope formula perfectly. y2 minus y1 all over x2 minus x1 minus a -3 is really a +3. A -9 minus a 7 is a -16, and a 5 plus a 3 is an 8. And I do not simplify. I leave it as a -16 over 8. Now, the bottom, the denominator, represents your run, which represents the length from your x values. And then your -16 is your rise, which would represent the distance away from your y values. So now, to find point P, I'm going to take my ratio of 4/5. I'm going to multiply it by my run, which is 8. And then I'm going to add it to the x value of my starting point, which I chose my starting point to be A, so -3. And to find the y value of point P, I take my ratio of 4/5. I multiply it by my rise, which is -16, and I add it to my y value of my starting point, which in this case is 7. So P Doing the calculations, and 8 times a 4/5, and then plus a -3 gives me a 3.4 as my x value for point P. A -16 times a 4/5 plus a 7 would give me a -5.8 as my y value for point P. If you want to write it as a fraction, a 3.4 would be a 3 2/5 for your x. A -5.8 would be a -5 4/5 for your y. If you want to write it as an improper fraction, that is okay as well. But this is your answer. All right, last problem for level 3. We're going to find point B, which lies 3/4 of the way along directed line segment AC. So what that means is that I have segment AC, and point B lies 3/4, since it says AC, so it lies 3/4 from point A. So 3/4, like that. So we already have the ratio given to us. All right, so my starting point was point A, so I'm going to label that x1, y1. So C would be x2, y2. So doing the slope formula perfectly, y2 minus y1 all over x2 minus x1. I wind up with a -1/8 as my slope, and I do not simplify. Okay, so now the run is my denominator, which represents the change in x. My rise is my numerator, which represents the change in y. To find point B, I take my ratio, which is what was given to us, 3/4. I multiply it by my run, which is an 8. And I add it to the x value of my starting point. My starting point was 10, or was A, so 10. For the y value, I take my ratio of 3/4, I multiply it by my rise, which is -1, and I add it to my y value of my starting point, which in this case is 5. So now just simplifying, an 8 times a 3/4 plus a 10 gives me that the x value of point B is 16, and a -1 times a 3/4 plus a 5 gives me that the y value of my point B is 4.25. All right, that brings us to the end of level 3.